Okay, in this video, we are going to work through a text together. It's only 6 paragraphs long, but we're going to take a deep dive. You should have already made a copy of the worksheet. This worksheet includes the text itself, as well as some questions you should be able to answer. So let's just start by putting our name on the worksheet and today's date. The name of the text is Famine, Affluence, and Morality by present living Australian philosopher Peter Singer. This text was written in 1972, so it's a little bit old, but it is one of the most famous texts in the area of applied ethics. You don't need to be able to define what it means to say we're looking at an applied ethics topic, but the short version is this. If you take a philosophy course in ethics, you're probably going to study a range of moral theories. Theories we can apply to cases in order to evaluate what we ought to do and why. When we are focused on a type of case itself, a specific problem, for example, is there anything wrong with eating animals? Is there anything wrong with euthanasia or abortion? And we could possibly approach it from lots of different ethical angles. We're doing an applied topic. Basically, we're applying all of our tools from thinking about ethics to a specific topic. So we're working on a very famous topic. Are there duties to provide humanitarian aid? And if so, why? What could ground those kinds of duties? And we're going to look at one famous paper and a famous moral principle proposed in this paper for answering that question. What, if any, obligations do we have and why? I picked this specific paper in part because it's famous, but mostly because I want us to focus on working with a moral principle. I want us to be able to practice applying a moral principle to case studies. And I want us to critically evaluate a moral principle in order to ask, how do we even argue for or against a moral principle? Isn't this just all a matter of opinion? We'll look at some examples of how that's done. Like last unit, you are going to write a pair of papers. Both papers are going to be focused on or connecting with this particular text. The first paper will be easier. I just want you to understand the text and the principle supported in the text. And I want you to be able to apply it to a case study and just explain what would follow if it were true. And the second paper is going to be the more interesting but also more difficult paper where you think about whether or not the principle is acceptable, is true, and why or why not. So that's where we're going, and that's where we're starting today. And because this paper is going to be at the center of your next 2 papers, it's really important to have a very deep, clear understanding of the principle we're about to encounter, as well as the argument in which that principle figures. So let's do it together. Okay, so follow along, complete the worksheet that you should have made a copy of as we go, and then when you're done, you'll download it as a PDF and you'll submit it in Canvas. We're going to start by reading the first 4 paragraphs, which I have labeled as the intro section. It's not an intro paragraph, but a section, because the paper is longer and sometimes it makes sense to break things up into paragraphs. What makes it an intro is the function that it plays, which is to introduce a guiding question and an answer to it. So we're going to look for the question or problem or challenge, possibly how it has been answered by a background conversation or alternative views, as well as the author's main claim. A main claim is an answer to a good question. So those are the key things we're looking for. Sometimes, not always, you'll also get a preview of the argumentative strategy or the structure of the paper, and when you get that, make a note of it. Okay, I'm going to read aloud, and as I do, I'm going to mark up some little features of text. I'm not going to mark up a lot, but maybe instead of looking at the video, you are looking at your version of the text and highlighting or marking up anything that you think is important, anything that you notice. Okay, paragraph 1. As I write this, in November of 1971, people are dying in East Bengal from a lack of food, shelter, and medical care. The suffering and death that are occurring there now are not inevitable, not unavoidable in any fatalistic sense of the term. Constant poverty, a cyclone, and a civil war have turned at least 9 million people into destitute refugees. Nevertheless, it's not beyond the capacity of the richer nations to give enough assistance to reduce any further suffering. The decisions and actions of human beings can prevent this kind of suffering. Unfortunately, human beings have not made the necessary decisions. At the individual level, people have, with very few exceptions, not responded to the situation in any significant way. Generally speaking, people have not given large sums to relief funds. They have not written their parliamentary representatives demanding increased government assistance. They have not demonstrated in the streets, held symbolic fasts, or done anything else directed toward providing the refugees with the means to satisfy their essential needs. At the government level, no government has given the sort of massive aid that would enable the refugees to survive for more than a few days. Britain has, for instance, given rather more than most countries. It has to date given 14 million and some pounds. For comparative purposes, Britain's share of the non-recoverable development costs of the Anglo-French Concord project is already in excess of 270 million, and on present estimates will reach 440 million. The implication is that the British government values a supersonic transport more than 30 times as highly as it values the lives of 9 million refugees. Australia is another country which, on a per capita basis, is well up in the aid to Bengal table. Australia's aid, however, amounts to less than 1/12 of the cost of Sydney's new opera house. The total amount given from all sources now stands at about 65 million pounds. The estimated cost of keeping the refugees alive for 1 year is 464 million. Most of the refugees have now been in the camps for more than 6 months. The World Bank has said that India needs a minimum of 300 million pounds in assistance from other countries before the end of the year. It seems obvious that that assistance on this scale will not be forthcoming. India will be forced to choose between letting the refugees starve or diverting funds from her own development program, which will mean that more of her people will starve in the future. These are the essential facts about the present situation in Bengal. So far as it concerns us here, there is nothing unique about this situation except its magnitude. The Bengal emergency is just the latest and most acute of a series of major emergencies in various parts of the world arising from both natural and man-made causes. There are also many parts of the world in which people die from malnutrition and lack of food independent of any special emergency. I take Bengal as my example only because it is the present concern and because the size of the problem has ensured that it has been given adequate publicity. Neither individuals nor governments can claim to be unaware of what's happening there. What are the moral implications of a situation like this? In what follows, I shall argue that The way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme, needs to be altered, and with it, the way of life that has come to be taken for granted in our society. In arguing for this conclusion, I will not, of course, claim to be morally neutral. I shall, however, try to argue for the moral position that I take, so that anyone who accepts certain assumptions to be made explicit will, I hope, accept my conclusion. Okay, let's pause and answer a few questions together. What is Singer's main claim? Which of the following are true? Is it a claim about what's happening in Bengal? Is it a claim about whether or not extreme poverty is preventable? Is it a claim about what affluent nations are doing or not doing to address extreme poverty? Or is it a claim about the moral obligations of individuals to do what they can to reduce conditions of extreme poverty? The correct answer is D. These claims have all been made in the opening section. There are claims about what's happening in Bengal. Right up front, he claims that it's preventable, and he clearly illustrates that affluent nations are doing X or Y. Those are all established up front. They're not the main claim of the paper. The main claim of the paper is the claim that's going to need 10 more pages of defense, right? So these are just the facts up front that give rise to a question, and the main claim is an answer to that question. This isn't exactly the way he put his claim, but he says the way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified. Well, what is it that people are doing? Nothing or not enough, right? And so something along the lines of people must do something to address conditions of extreme poverty. Doing nothing is not acceptable. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues and what our obligations are needs to be altered, or something like that. So he hasn't said it in these words, but these are definitely not the main claim. So let's paraphrase and cite. Whenever you paraphrase, you are required to provide a citation. Citation is not the same word as quotation. When you quote something, that means you are using the words verbatim. You put the quote marks around it and you provide a citation. But when you paraphrase, you put it into your own words. It's the author's idea, but it's in your words. You still provide a citation. The best citation is the one that guides your reader to where you found it. So if you can point to a paragraph or a page where you found the thing that you are paraphrasing, that is the information that will help your reader find what you're talking about. Citations aren't just about giving credit where credit's due or making it clear that ideas aren't your own. They're also important when you think about yourself as a scholar who's working together with other scholars. When people read your paper and want to follow up on your sources and read and engage with them themselves, you're providing the breadcrumbs to help them do that, so they don't have to, start from scratch and read the whole paper to find out what you're referring to. So let's grab some quotes as a place to start. Maybe you noticed, if you were watching the video as I read this, I was highlighting things in different colors. For what it's worth, when I highlight texts, I have colors that represent different, for lack of a better term, functions in a text. Sometimes people just choose one color and highlight everything that seems important. But then if you look at a text, it's just a lot of highlighting, and the only information you get is here was a bunch of important stuff. But texts have structure. They have an argumentative structure, and they also do things by making, let's call them writerly choices to communicate. So for example, phrasing like this: in what follows, I shall argue that. That is phrasing that communicates to the reader the next sentence is the main claim, or at least a claim that is going to get argued for. So some kind of conclusion or sub-conclusion in the text. This is something writers do to make it clear what their position is. And in philosophy papers, this kind of explicit, I will argue that, is very common. And it will also be very common to use first-person language. Sometimes this feels weird to students who are not familiar with philosophy, but it's very common to use first-person language. It's common in lots of academic writing contexts as well. If any reason can be given against it, maybe at the high school level, it's that when people use first-person language, they're more inclined to talk about their opinions and feelings without arguing for them. But if you are going to state the claim you shall argue for, you are in the business of writing an academic argumentative paper. Okay, so I highlight things like that help me just track the structure of the text. I also have a separate color for questions. I'll use teal whenever a question that's going to get answered comes up. I will bold things that are main claims. And if I'm not actually, like this is a Google Doc, right? But in a PDF, you can't bold stuff. So sometimes I'll use green to signal that this is a main claim. I'll use red to highlight something that's an objection. That way, when you look at the highlighting, some of the structure of the text pops out. And this might be especially useful if you're reading a text that has a lot of back and forth of arguments, as philosophy papers do, because sometimes it is difficult to track the author's view when they're going back and forth between a hypothetical objection, their response, an objection to that response, a rebuttal, another. So kind of seeing which arguments are objections, which bits are rebuttals, can be useful to do. Okay, let's move on. What were we doing? We were identifying the guiding question and the main claim, and let's just start by using a direct quotation. So here's where the question was literally asked. So I'm going to put it in quote marks because I'm copying and pasting it. And I'm going to immediately add citations because that's when it's easiest to find your citations. The minute you've grabbed a bit of text, write down the citation. If you write stuff down and then have to go find them later, it's a whole extra step, and it's a painful, annoying step. And it's one that leaves you open to accidentally plagiarizing or just being a bad scholar. Okay. And then we've got the claim, right? So all of this, I'm just going to copy. I'm not worried about if it's grammatical yet. I'm just getting it on paper and putting it in quote marks just so I don't forget later that I copied this. Another tip, if you're taking notes on a text, have some way of signaling to yourself which things are your own ideas. For example, I always use like 3 little slash marks whenever I'm not paraphrasing or taking notes, but thinking and adding my own thoughts to my notes. Okay, so let's start with the question. What are the moral implications of a situation like this? This question doesn't stand on its own outside the context of the introduction I just copied it and pasted it out of. It refers to a situation like this. The this refers to something we just removed the quote from. So if you're going to address this, let's say in a summary of Singer's argument, you wouldn't want to just include this because the reader wouldn't know what you're talking about. It's also just important to think about, well, wait, what does he mean by a situation like this? He gives us a case, and then he says about this case, here are the essential facts, but there's nothing unique about this situation. This is just the latest and most acute of a series of emergencies. There are lots of places where people just die every day of nutrition because of ongoing issues, not an earthquake or a flood or some sort of current, quote, special emergency. And he says, I take Bengal as my example only because it happens to be the present concern and the size of the problem means it's gotten publicity. So there's nothing special about this case itself. It's situations like Bengal that are of interest. And the question is, what are the moral implications of situations like that? Well, what are the features? Let's start there. Write this down in your box. What are the features of the Bengal situation that this example highlights, such that we're forced to ask moral questions? And there might be some like, it's in Bengal, or that is not a current name of a location, but that wouldn't be relevant. For Singer's point, what are the relevant features of this situation that raise moral questions? So those are some of the things I was highlighting in yellow, and yellow is my sort of, doesn't mean anything in particular color, just highlighting things that stand out. Okay, so that situation is not inevitable. People can act, they can make decisions that would prevent suffering. Another fact is people have not made the decisions, not at the level of individuals and not at the level of governments. There are ways to further spell that out, right? But those are some of the biggest features. And not to mention, people are suffering and dying. And specifically from lack of the most basic resources. It's not inevitable, is the claim. But people aren't acting, not at the level of individuals, not at the level of governments. They are, this connects to it's not being inevitable, making choices. Again, are we talking about individuals? Are we talking about the level of groups or governments? And even at the individual level, sometimes we'll use the word we throughout this. What should we do? And we can always stop and ask, who's we? Because people are different, not only in their choices, but in their capacities. We're going to get into those details, and they're certainly not irrelevant questions that will just get brushed under a rug. But the claim is that people are making choices that imply they value things like supersonic transport. I don't know, is this some kind of train? I'm not familiar with the name of the project. And opera houses and arts and stuff. Now, the exact numbers and the exact choices will vary, right? So we could write something more general. They value, arts and advanced transportation and such social nice to haves more than the lives of huge numbers of people. Okay, so those are the relevant features. How might we paraphrase the guiding question? What is Singer's guiding question? Write a paraphrase of your own and provide the citation, paragraph number 3. I'm not going to write mine here, but I'd like you to write one. It should be in your worksheet. Pause the video and do it before moving on. What about the main claim? So a good main claim is an answer to a good question. A good question is one that's not obvious. You can't just Google it. And there's room for interesting disagreement about that question. And of course there is here, because one of the things Singer says is that our way of responding to situations like the one in Bengal is connected to the way we look at moral issues our moral conceptual scheme. Again, who's we? Different people think different things and respond in different ways, but here we're talking about the level of society at the very least and some general tendencies. Maybe we have to do a poll to figure this out or do careful work in sociology, but there is a way that we tend to look at moral issues. And his claim is that it doesn't hold up to scrutiny, that it's not justified, that we ought to change the way that we, at least generally, this, whatever this is, we ought to change it and accept a different way of looking at the world and our place in it and our moral obligations. And so clearly there is a room for disagreement, what most people think and what Singer is suggesting. So there's a good question here, one that requires arguing for possible answers. And Singer has proposed a possible answer. A main claim is an answer to a question. The quoted version is this: the way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that. What is the way they react? Again, we're referring to something that was illustrated in a case study. When we grab a quote, the reader doesn't know what the quote is referring to, and so you have to fill that in. And the situation like that in Bengal, we're referring to the thing illustrated in paragraph 1. When you pull the quote out of its context, you have to make sure that context is still understandable to the reader when you quote or paraphrase. Cannot be justified. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues needs to be altered. Okay, so now write a paraphrase of Singer's main claim. And provide the citation, of course, and make sure these things are clear enough to a reader if they are part of your paraphrase of the claim. Pause the video, make sure you have that done. Then let's move on and keep reading. Okay, so in the next two paragraphs, 5 and 6, Singer's going to introduce a few basic premises of an argument, and we're going to read this with an eye toward understanding his proposed moral principle. We're about to get a moral principle. And then we also want to be able to reconstruct his argument in standard form, list the premises explicitly, list the conclusion, and then also map it. These are very similar tasks, so we'll do both together. Paragraph 5. I begin with the assumption that, okay, the writer is using phrasing that tells us I'm about to state a premise. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. That is a claim. I think most people will agree about this, although one may reach the same view by different routes. I have taught this paper many times, and sometimes I begin with surveys, and I can attest that most people do indeed agree with this. Sometimes students will say something like nothing is truly good or bad, and so not even suffering and death can be truly bad. In which case, Singer's response here might apply to that. I shall not argue for this view. People can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, perhaps like nothing is bad. And perhaps from some of them, it wouldn't follow that death by starvation is in itself bad. It's difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions. And so for brevity, I will henceforth take this assumption as accepted. Those who disagree need read no further unless the paper has been assigned to you and you're required to understand it and write about it, in which case you definitely read further. But if you don't accept this premise, you won't accept the argument. An argument has two parts, right? The premises themselves have to be acceptable, and they have to provide support for the conclusion. There's sort of a two-step. And by acceptable, I mean aren't objectionable. We have reason to think they're true, not just like it's practical or we like them or they make us feel good. We have reason to think that they're true, they're acceptable, they're not objectionable, and they actually provide good support for the conclusion. So those are the two things we're looking for. And if you fundamentally disagree with a premise, you think this isn't true, I have reason to think it's false, or I'm more committed to the falsity of this principle than anything else involved in this argument, then you will not find the argument compelling. You might be wrong, but you won't find it compelling. And we don't always argue for all of our premises. Usually when you state a premise, notice he's stating it as a topic sentence of the paragraph. That's a really common thing to do, and then develop support in the body. But he's saying, look, this is a crucial assumption in my argument, and I'm not arguing for it. But if you accept it, and I think most people do, here's what follows from your beliefs. Okay, so let's move on. My next point is this. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. This is a principle about when we have a moral obligation to act. Notice that it is an if-then claim. It's a conditional statement. So I'm going to highlight the if because this is an important fact. And in English, we often don't state the then, but I'm going to fill it in here just to make the structure of the sentence super clear. It's an if-then statement. It's a principle that says, if the bits after the if are met, think of these as criteria, then this is the action that is required of you. And notice there are 3 criteria. Criteria number 1 is it is in our power. So I'm just gonna choose any color. It is in our power. To prevent something bad from happening. So something bad is happening. It's in our power to prevent it. And we can do so without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. When those 3 criteria are met, you ought morally to act to prevent the bad thing from happening. By without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I mean without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable in significance to the bad thing we can prevent. I want to highlight that there are 3 parts here. What do you mean sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance? He says there are 3 things. Definitely highlight this. Okay. Here's a way of thinking about sacrificing something of moral importance that's just really simple. Giving up time or money. I'm not talking about its importance, I'm talking about the sacrifice part. If you have to sacrifice time or money, it is clear that you are sacrificing. You can point at the thing and you can say, I'm giving this thing up. Just, it makes perfect sense. And then we can talk about how important is that thing? Is it comparably important to the thing you're trying to prevent? Is the amount of money and time you'd have to give up as important as the life of a child? But it's clear what the sacrifice is in that case. Whereas when he says, what I mean is this, without causing anything else comparably bad to happen. If the only way you could prevent this bad thing from happening is to do something that actually causes more harm than good, more harm than you're trying to prevent, he says that would also be sacrificing something comparable in moral importance. In this case, you're not like giving up time and money, but it's still, he says what he means when he says sacrificing anything of moral importance, of comparable moral importance. So don't just be thinking about sacrifices as giving up time and money. Think of them more broadly as, what does it take for me to prevent this bad thing from happening? Will I end up doing more harm than good? Then I'm sacrificing something of comparable moral importance and it's not required. Or would it require doing something that's wrong in itself? Like murder, stealing, or something, pick something that is wrong in and of itself, if that's the only way that you could prevent the bad thing from happening, it says you're not required to do it because that too would count as sacrificing something of comparable moral importance. Or if the only way that you could prevent the bad thing from happening is that you fail to promote some comparably good thing, right? Let's say you have two options and they're both equally good, and the only way that you could prevent the bad thing from happening is to give up your opportunity to do something that's equally good. Well, you're not required to do that, in which case you have a choice between the two equally good things. So this is about what's required. It doesn't say you can't sacrifice things that are morally important. It says it's not required. So if you would have to sacrifice a great deal of time and money that is comparable importance, at least given the phrasing of the principle, all it says is it's not required of you. Okay, so that's what the principle means. There are 3 criteria. When they're met, you have an obligation, and this is specifically what it means to sacrifice something of comparable moral importance, according to the author. This principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one. Is that true? When I ask students this, when I poll it in the context of teaching it in person, they usually say yes, and likewise in surveys, that it seems really, really plausible. It requires us only to prevent what's bad, promote what's good, and it requires this of us only when we can do it without sacrificing anything that is, from the moral point of view, comparably important. I could even, as far as the application of my argument, like we're talking about application of my argument, so far we haven't really gotten explicitly a whole argument, we've gotten a principle. I could even, as far as the application of my argument to the Bengal emergency is concerned, qualify the point so as to make it. Let's highlight this. Here's a qualified version of the principle, an alternative principle. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. If upon first read, you're like, that sounded like the same principle. It's very similar. Structurally, most of the words are the same. So let's figure out what's different. Again, it's an if-then. If certain criteria are met, then you have a moral obligation, says the principle. What has changed? It's in our power, still is an important criterion, that's still there, to prevent something very bad from happening. Is that relevant? Or was the author just being sloppy and changing the word bad and very bad, but not really meaning to change that part? Hard to say, but it does make sense, right? So if this one says you have to prevent all the bad things from happening when you can without having to sacrifice something of comparable moral significance, this one says you don't have to prevent all the bad things, just the very bad things. So that's a possible difference. Without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant. The other one said without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. So I'm going to highlight this in a different color just to compare. What's the difference? One says, if there's something bad from happening and it's in your power to prevent it, and it doesn't require you sacrifice anything of comparable moral importance, then you are required to act. And the other one says, if it's in your power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant at all, then you are morally required to act. What's the difference? Which principle is stronger? What does it mean to say one principle is stronger than another? What I mean in this case is which one requires more of you? let's call the stronger principle the one that requires more of you, and the weaker one the one that requires less of you. Which of these two moral principles, call this number 1 and this one number 2, requires more of you? The answer is this one. Whenever it's in your power to prevent something bad from happening, and it doesn't require that you sacrifice something comparable. So when we're talking about, say, refugee crisis, humanitarian aid situations, we're always talking about children in addition to many adults, but children in particular are an easy case to think about because it's such a poignant, morally compelling example, because children are innocent. There's no way you could try to identify how they're responsible for their own situation. They have a whole future ahead of them. So we're thinking about the lives of children here. When you could prevent something very bad from happening to children, or something bad from happening to children, this principle says, is it in your power? Check. Is the thing that's happening very bad? Yeah, or bad? Yes, indeed, it's very bad. And would you have to give up something comparable in moral importance to help? That means, would you have to give up anything as important as the life of a child in order to help? If those 3 criteria are met, if the answer is no, then you ought to act to prevent the suffering and death of that child. Compare with this principle. Again, imagine a child is at risk of suffering and dying, and it is in your power to prevent it. And of course, that is a very bad thing, the suffering and death of a child. Are you in a position to prevent it without having to sacrifice anything morally significant? Doesn't have to be at the level of the life of a child, just something morally significant. Of course, we might then ask, what does it mean for something to be morally significant? At least I kind of know how to think about what you mean when you say something on a par with the life of a child. But what does it mean for a thing to be morally significant? Which things are morally significant? How should I think about the fact that people disagree about this? All good questions, but let's say that we just use this as kind of a vaguely defined concept that we'll probably agree on a lot about. In the past, I have made a Google Jamboard where people can sort of put examples of things that are significant or not significant and move them around. And most students in the classes where we've done this activity have agreed on a lot. There were a bunch of things in the middle where some people maybe thought they were significant and some didn't, but they agreed on a lot. Here are things that definitely are, and here are things that definitely aren't. And so we agree on a lot, and even if we allow the individual to make their own choices about what's morally significant, the question is still relevant here. What's in your power? Can you prevent a very bad thing from happening? And what would you have to sacrifice? Is that thing morally significant? Or do your best as an individual to assess whether or not it is, as honestly as you can. If those criteria are met, you have an obligation to act. Okay, an application of this principle would be as follows. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and I see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. So we could go further in spelling out how the application of the principle is applied here, or how the principle is applied here, how this is an application. Is it in your power to, well, let's start with is something very bad about to happen? Yes, a child drowning is a very bad thing, right? The death of the child would be a very bad thing, okay? Is it in our power? Yes. It isn't stated here that it's in your power, but assume you are an able-bodied person in close enough proximity. I mean, you're walking past the shallow pond, you can get the child out. If you, for whatever reason, can't, then this criterion wouldn't be met. So assume it is in your power and the death of the child is very bad. Would you have to sacrifice anything morally significant? Well, what would the sacrifices be? Getting your clothes muddy, but that's insignificant. So if the only sacrifice is muddying your clothes, and maybe irreparably, maybe it'll ruin them, you don't just get to wash them or something. Maybe even you're wearing fancy clothes. Say your clothes cost $200 and you're going to totally ruin them irreparably. Maybe you'll even lose a little bit of time. Are those things morally important? Sometimes students say like, well, what if it's your only pair of clothes? Okay, so maybe having clothing is a morally significant thing, but maybe having a designer pair of shoes, one amongst many, is not. So here, there is real room to ask what is morally significant and why, and what should we make of the fact that people disagree about this. But if you agree that a 20th pair of designer shoes is insignificant, especially in contrast with the life of a child, then these criteria are met and you have an obligation. Now, this is not itself an argument for the principle, at least not necessarily. It just illustrates how the principle works. That being said, in many cases, I have given this scenario to students as a survey before we start reading this paper. And I give them this case and I ask them whether they think one has a moral obligation to rescue the child in the case given these specific consequences. I am not asking, would you do it? I'm asking, is it morally required? Is it wrong not to do it? Sometimes people take up the position that it's not wrong to do nothing. You're not morally required to help, but also would say, I totally would. Of course I would, but I'm not morally required to, or something like that. Sometimes students say that. But for the most part, 90+% of students given this case say you are morally required to help. It would be wrong not to. And then when asked to give a justification for it, they identify the fact that the shoes don't even kind of compare to the importance of the child. They are naturally inclined to assess their moral obligations by thinking about what matters and weighing it against each other. So that this principle has some plausibility. It provides a plausible explanation of a moral obligation in a clear case that we all agree about, might be some amount of support for the principle itself. Some amount of support, not a knockdown argument, but some amount of support. And if there can be given additional support, and if we can rule out alternatives as not being plausible moral theories, that will further add to the support for accepting this principle. And that's the kind of thing we'll do in a couple of weeks. For now, we aren't trying to evaluate the moral principle or the argument in which it figures. We're just trying to understand the principle and the argument and then apply it to cases and think about what follows if it's true, emphasis on if. Okay, continuing on, the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. What does that mean? What's deceptive? Not the principle itself, but the uncontroversial appearance of it. As he said before, this principle seems uncontroversial. When I first present it to students and ask, does that seem plausible? They generally say yes, and especially for this one after we've compared the two. But even if we accept the weaker one that requires less of us, the uncontroversial appearance of it is deceptive because, let's continue on, if it were acted upon, even in its qualified form, our lives, society, and world would be fundamentally changed. It requires that whenever it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing something morally significant, we act. Not just one time, but when, to the extent that we can, we ought to do what we can, what is in our power, to prevent very bad things from happening. And there are many around the world, even if we just focused on the very baddest of the bad, including suffering and dying from lack of the most basic resources. So if it's in our power to prevent those things, and it doesn't require the sacrifice of something morally significant, where look around at our consumer spending, we spend a lot of money on things that are not morally significant. If those criteria are met, we ought to be acting much more to a greater degree than we are. And I used the word we a lot in that last couple of sentences. And so of course we should ask, well, who's we? Because it will vary by individual, what is in their power and what kind of sacrifice will be required. And indeed, so if you have somebody who lives in an affluent country, but is not themselves affluent and indeed is struggling to get by, then perhaps any amount of sacrifice made would be morally significant if it's going to take, say, food off the table of their own children, in which case that individual would not have a moral obligation because this criterion is not met. Or even if we have the resources, if we don't have the ability to turn them into preventing the bad thing from happening, we wouldn't have an obligation. But it's initially plausible that many people living in affluent countries do have the power, perhaps indirectly by sending checks to effective agencies that do a lot of good in preventing very bad things from happening, and that it wouldn't require morally significant sacrifice on their part. And for all of those people, they ought to be helping, and that will be more people than do help, and it will require more helping than is typically thought to be required. And so that is the sense in which this principle initially seems uncontroversial, but is deceptive, at least insofar as it's not how we live. It doesn't describe how we live. It's a bar that is higher than the one that is currently met by people in general. And if it were acted on by everyone, things would look pretty different. Okay, let's answer some questions. According to Singer's principle, if the following three criteria are met, you have an obligation to act. This is what are the three criteria after the if and before the then. Feel free to use just the second principle, the weaker one. It's in your power. There is something very bad. It's in your power to prevent that something very bad. And doing so would not require that you sacrifice anything of moral significance. Again, this is just, you're not required to do this. If you do sacrifice something of moral significance, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not allowed to do that, just that it's only required that you act when these things are met. So list those three things, and then provide, whenever you are writing stuff from the text, especially if you use quotations, put the paragraph number. This is all in paragraph 6. What counts as sacrificing something of comparable moral importance? List the three different things and try to come up with an example of each. So this is right where he's introduced the principle for the first time. And he says, what I mean by this is, what is an example where the only way you could help would actually cause more harm than the good you can do or the bad that you can prevent? What's an example of that? That's not required, he says. That would be to sacrifice something of comparable moral significance. Or how could you, what's a way that in order to prevent something bad from happening, you'd have to do something wrong in itself? The principle does not require that. That would be to sacrifice something of comparable moral importance. Or what is an example where in order to prevent a bad thing from happening, you give up an opportunity to do something that is equally good? Because that would also be a sacrifice of something comparable and would not be required. In this case, it would be a choice. And then here's a follow-up question that's more advanced. So maybe not everyone needs to answer it, but if you're interested, how does that translate here? These are all about comparable cases, right? If something comparably bad would happen, and especially for this one, if you'd give up an opportunity to promote something of comparable good, you're not required to do that. Here, we've lowered the bar from comparable to morally significant, and that should change what these three things are slightly, the wording of those things, but feel free to just use the original wording. The point is really to underscore, we're not just talking about look at the thing that you would be sacrificing, time and money, and asking is time and money, in this case, morally significant. It's a broader conception than that. And you'll need to know that in order to charitably, fairly, accurately apply his principle to cases. Okay, copy and paste the two versions here and highlight the differences and tell me which one is stronger. We already talked about this. And from here on out, we're only going to refer to version 2, the weaker one that requires less of us. At this point, let's reconstruct the argument in standard form and then map it. So I'm going to start just by copying and pasting a premise. Premise 1. We'll fix the punctuation later. That came from paragraph 5. And now I'm going to copy and paste the weaker version of the principle as another premise in the argument. Let's call this premise 1. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. That was paragraph 5. Premise 2. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, then we morally ought to do it. And that is paragraph 6. And then what else? That's just 2 claims. What's the conclusion? Is the argument complete, or do we have to analyze the argument to fill in implicit bits? What do you think the conclusion is? If somebody just says this, look, suffering and death is clearly a very bad thing, and it's in our power to prevent and if it's in our power to prevent bad things from happening, then we ought to do it. Presumably, the claim is we ought to do it. It what? What ought we to do? We ought to act to prevent. And from here on out, I'm going to let S and D mean suffering and death from the lack of the most basic resources. Okay. Is this a valid argument? If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Principle: if these 3 criteria are met, you ought to act. Well, suffering and death is very bad, so you ought to act. Are the 3 criteria met? What if it's not in your power? Or what if you'd have to sacrifice something morally significant? Those objections or questions that you might turn into objections, in some cases, it's not in our power. In some cases, we'd have to sacrifice something morally significant. And if we're in one of those cases, we wouldn't have an obligation. In order for these premises to imply the conclusion, we need to fill in 2 implicit premises. It is in our power to act, or at least implicit in paragraphs 5 and 6. Recall paragraph 1. He underscores that in this particular case in Bengal, it's in our power to do something. The suffering and death is not inevitable. So we might, cite paragraph 1 as where we're getting this information. He certainly believes this, and that is highlighted in paragraph 1. And it is in our power to do so without having to sacrifice anything of moral significance. He certainly talks about the choices that, at least at the larger level, people are making, that governments are making in funding transportation, modern transportation, or the arts, opera houses, right? And if we're making claims about what's comparable, maybe an opera house is not comparable to the lives of 9 million people, is something most people would accept. But maybe the arts are morally significant, is having a fancy new opera house, which is itself a piece of art, plus it's a space for art. Is that morally significant? I think there's reasonable grounds for talking about that. So I'm not sure if he specifically addresses this, but paragraph 1 does prevent some support for thinking It is in our power, and we are making choices to use our resources on things that are not morally significant, even by our own lights. We don't focus in the intro paragraph on the individual, but we easily could. So let's just treat these as like initially highlighted in paragraph 1, but kind of implicit too, especially if we're talking about individuals and what's in our power, like sending money to aid agencies. And what counts is we spend a lot of money on consumer goods and fast fashion and water in bottles when perfectly safe water comes from the tap, depending on where you live. So these are quasi implicit, kind of hinted at in the intro. When we fill them in, we now have a valid argument. Valid meaning if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That doesn't mean that the argument is overall good, because we might also ask, are the premises true? And presumably in many cases, it is in our power to do something. Whose we depends, right? And in many cases, it's in our power to do something without having to sacrifice something morally significant. And we'll just assume, like Singer, that this is true. And so if his principle is true, this will follow, at least in a range of cases. We ought to act when these criteria are met. I want to highlight the structure of this argument. So here is a pattern of reasoning that is always valid. If P, then Q. P, thus Q. This pattern of reasoning is always valid. If you were born in the US, then you are a citizen. You were born in the US, thus you are a citizen. This one isn't good. So if we take the same premise, if P, then Q, and we add Q, thus P, this looks like the first one, but this one actually isn't valid. It's possible the premises are true and the conclusion is false. If you're born in the United States, then you are a citizen. You are a citizen, thus you were born in the United States. Not necessarily. This could be true, and this could be true. You are a citizen, but you're a naturalized citizen, in which case that you were born in the United States is not true. So if it's possible an argument can have true premises and a false conclusion, it's not valid. Any argument that has this pattern is valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. This is such a common pattern of reasoning, an important one, and it shows up a lot in philosophy papers, that it's worth giving it a name. This name goes all the way back to Aristotle in 4th-ish century BC. So it's an old name. You don't have to memorize it, but the pattern should look familiar to you from here on out. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. And this argument has this structure. What comes after the if is a little more complex. So think of it as if P1 and P2 and not 3 and P3. If all of those, it's a conjunction of 3 things. If all of these 3 things are met, not just if one is, but all of them, then Q. And so we need to have all 3 of them be met in order to generate the conclusion. So this is the structure, the pattern of reasoning, and it is a valid one. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. I know you've studied this in the first bit of the class, but let's just write this down because it's such a crucial concept for our class. Valid means, and I'm going to define it 2 ways. 1, if the premises are all of them, not just some of them, all true, then the conclusion must be true. That's one way of defining it. Here is a logically equivalent way of defining it. It is impossible that the premises are or could be true, and yet the conclusion is false. So I'm not saying the premises are in fact true. I'm saying if they are true, the conclusion would have to be true. It's impossible that they could all be true and the conclusion false. Validity is about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, not the truth or falsity of the premises themselves. Okay, let's map the argument in MindMap. All right, in Google Drive, I already have MindMap connected to my Google Drive, and you should too. So in Google Drive, not Google Docs or something else, Google Drive, I click New, just like I would do to make a new doc or some other type of file. I'm going to go to More, and then I'm going to go down to MindMap. Yours probably won't have this option. When it initially loads, it'll be in the wrong mode. It will be in like general concept mapping mode, and you'll get a dark blue square. Dark blue squares are bad. And if you start adding in, I don't even really know how to use the tools because I never use this. If you start adding in things and like they're looking blue and gray and like octopuses, that's bad. So let's undo that. And let's go to View, Start Argument Visualization. This changes all of our tools and allows us to visualize arguments, which is clearly what we are practicing. Let's give our map a name, Singer's argument. Let's turn on autosave. I get a little prompt. Sometimes students say they don't, but you can go to File, turn on autosave. All right, and we are ready to map. What I'm going to do is copy and paste. I've already put the argument in standard form. Each one of these should be in a box. We know this is the conclusion. The only question is, are these co-premises or are they independent premises? So as I'm doing this, navigate away, open up your own map, and make 4 boxes. Just copy and paste your premises and conclusion into 4 boxes, and then decide how to map it. I'm going to start with the conclusion. All right, here are my boxes. All I did was copy and paste, and now I need to rearrange them. And also, like, you can resize them if it's weird that it is like one thing hanging over. Okay, so we said this is the where is the conclusion? We ought to act to prevent suffering and death. This is our conclusion. How should we map it? And it's nice that you can drag and drop premises onto a box and compare the different ways of mapping it. So if we drop them each onto the conclusion itself, it will automatically make them independent premises. And it doesn't matter logically what order they're in. It's nice when they're in the order you meant them to be in, or in an order that makes sense to read it. But maps aren't for communicating arguments to each other. They're about mapping the structure of the argument for our own understanding of the argument and as a strategic way to evaluate the argument, because the structure of the argument is relevant to how you evaluate it and come up with objections and figure out what needs support. So is this correct? Are each of these on their own a reason why we ought to prevent suffering and death? If you're inclined to say yes, let me rephrase the question. Do each one of these reasons provide the same level of support on their own as they do together as a group? And there the answer is no. When we put them together, look, we can drag and drop. So I've picked this up and I'm going to drag and drop it in this area under the bar and above the box when you do, and it has to be where your cursor is. So if like I pick this up over here, now the box is not good enough. It has to be where your cursor is. When you put your cursor under the bar, it'll drag and drop here. When all of these are true together, it provides watertight support. It's a valid argument. If all of these are true, then the conclusion must be true. The premise on its own doesn't support anything. This just tells you, well, if it's in your power, blah, 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 you ought to act. That doesn't imply you ought to act. This just tells you if something happens, you ought to act. If you rob a bank, then you committed a felony. Doesn't follow that you committed a felony. That's just a principled claim about what's true, or a conditional claim about what's true. If you robbed a bank, then you committed a felony. You need the further premise that you robbed the bank to get to the conclusion that you have indeed committed a felony. So we need all of these things in the argument. When they are together, foolproof support. When they are alone, not, and by foolproof, I mean like watertight or airtight or something that is a good visualization or metaphor for validity. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. You get a guarantee, 100% guarantee. Not on their own. On their own, they do not provide a guarantee. Okay. So here's our argument. Let's call these, let's label them just to make it clear. So let's call this Singer's principle. Let's call this the value claim. This is a claim about what's bad. We're taking this as an assumption throughout the rest of the unit. This is a claim about what's in our power. Let's call this the effectiveness claim. This is a claim about what's actually in our power. And this is a claim about what we'd have to give up. Let's call this the sacrifice claim. And again, it's not just about the time and money you would give up, but the broader thing Singer means when he says what counts as a sacrifice. We could fill that in right now, actually. Let's do that. The action required to prevent the bad thing from happening is not wrong in and of itself. You aren't going to cause more harm than the harm you're trying to prevent. Okay, I didn't word this super grammatically well, but it doesn't matter. Now, this is the way of wording it if we're talking about comparable sacrifice. This one can probably stay the same. This one, we might say acting will not bring about more harm than it prevents. It will not bring about harm or bad. And this one, it won't require missing out on something. There's going to be no loss of something morally significant. And it doesn't require that we give up an opportunity. Sometimes this is called an opportunity cost, when in order to pursue something, you give up an opportunity. And this is where the typical intuitive cases of what you've got to sacrifice are going to go up here, right? So let's think about the child in the pond. Are all of these premises true in the child in the pond case? Okay, so the principle is a generic one. Value claim, suffering and death, we would just change to the drowning of the child in the pond. The child's drowning is very bad or whatever. It's in our power to prevent the child from drowning. It's in our power to do so without having to sacrifice anything of morally significant. Preventing a child from drowning is not wrong in itself. In preventing the child from drowning, you are not going to lose something of moral significance. You're not going to bring about something that is worse. Maybe you could put your whatever thing you'd be giving up in either one. So for example, the shoes. You'll lose your shoes, but maybe we could even put this. That's true. Your shoes. But your shoes are not significant. That's the only cost. That cost isn't significant. Therefore, acting does not bring about anything morally bad. There isn't a loss of something morally significant. And then maybe it doesn't require you to give up something good, like your opportunity to be on time to work or something like that. So maybe actually most of the things that are sacrifices will go under this one. But there might also be cases like sometimes students will say, like, what if the child in the pond is Hitler? Like a baby Hitler. Could be like some serial killer child. And then we'd have to say something like all the bad things the child goes on to do are worse than are a really bad thing, or something like that. So we could also put that kind of thing as in no, we'd put this as an objection. Whenever you list something as green and you want to change it to an objection, there's a toggle thing up here. So this would be an objection. If the claim is it won't bring about anything bad from happening, and you were to say something like the child in the pond could grow up to do bad things, and that would be to bring about more bad or some amount of bad in order, as a result of your trying to prevent something bad. And how might we respond to this? This isn't our point, but this is a theoretical possibility. We don't get to know the consequences of our actions 100%. The best we can do in any case is what we expect. So we might think about the expected outcomes and expected value of those outcomes instead of theoretical possibilities. So if there's no reason to think like this could be true, but there's no reason to think that it's true. Maybe that's not really the most interesting objection here. Theoretical possibility merely. The point is, these are the kinds of things we'd have to think about, and we'd have to rule out there are no such things like that in order to make the claim that we can act without having to give up something morally significant. Okay, so let's keep this generic, and now let's take a picture of it and stick it into our document. I'm going to make it a little narrower so that way it's not wider than a typical document and the picture will look nicer. This isn't a big deal, but okay, that should fit in a document fine. To take a partial screenshot on a Mac, I'm pressing Command Shift and number 4, plain old number 4, and it makes little crosshairs like this. And you can just take a picture just of this. And now I've taken a screenshot, and I can drop that screenshot into my worksheet. You can also go to Insert, Upload Photo, but I know where my screenshots go, and I'm just going to quick drag and drop it here. So there's my map of Singer's argument. And let's end by testing our understanding of the argument by applying it to very simple cases using our claim, define, connect template. So Singer already answered this one, right? So clearly, if Singer's principle is true, and we know that part of the claim, define, connect template is to state the principle, so let's go copy it for future use. Okay. So you see a child drowning in a pond. To get to it, you'd have to ruin your fancy shoes. According to Singer's principle, are you morally required to rescue the child, or is it morally optional? Nice of you to do, but not required. Answer, claim. According to Singer's principle, you are morally required to rescue the child. To do nothing is morally wrong. That's essentially to say the same thing. Singer's principle states that if it is in our power, blah, 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 citation. I'm not paraphrasing Singer's principle because the exact wording of the principle is both famous and every word matters. There may be a way to paraphrase this principle, and you're welcome to do so as long as all of the key features of the principle are there. And usually when students try to paraphrase this principle, they leave out something that's essential. They'll say something like, essentially, you ought to do whatever you can. But there's a caveat. This is part of the principle. You're not required to sacrifice anything morally significant. And that's a key part of the principle. So if you treat it like it doesn't have this qualification, you are possibly critiquing a different principle, not Singer's, and may end up creating a straw man objection to Singer's principle, where you don't actually object to his principle and argument based on it, but something based on a slightly different principle. So if you were to paraphrase it, it has to have the 3 main parts. And that's exactly what the connect phase is supposed to do. In connecting the principle to a case, it highlights that you understand what the most important parts of the principle are. And that is, in this case, that there are 3 criteria that, if they're satisfied, generate a moral obligation. So when you apply it, you need to look at the case and look for those 3 criteria. Are they met? In this case, if you haven't already paused to try to do this on your own, pause now and fill in the connect step on your own. Write it up, and then we'll compare. Assuming you've done that, in this case, the death of the child would be a very bad thing. And by assumption, presumably, it doesn't say that, but, so let's say, and presumably, so that's two criteria. The death of the child would be bad, and presumably we're physically able to rescue the child. The only sacrifice involved is a pair of shoes, and shoes are not, and maybe it's like fancy shoes. Presumably one among many, given that most people living in Western countries have many pairs of shoes, especially if you own a fancy pair, but okay, so essentially the connect part is where you make an argument that requires you understand the principle, and sometimes it will be a little more complex, right? Where you have to think about what's really in our power, why think that? So presumably we're physically able. Is it in our power? One of the things that makes this case so simple is that it's just super clear that it's in our power, assuming one basic assumption that we're physically able-bodied in ways relevant to rescuing the child. So as long as that's met, all you have to do is like bend over and grab child. It's clear you will be effective. So the harder thing to defend here is, and not hard, just more complex, is what is the sacrifice? We could go further in spelling this out, right? Rescuing the child doesn't involve doing anything morally wrong. We're not giving up an opportunity to do a greater amount of good or even any amount of good. And the only thing we are giving up is shoes, and that's not a huge loss, right? So you could go further in saying those kinds of things, and then it'd be worth doing because we're practicing fully spelling out our argument, all the details, even if they're minor and obvious to most readers. Now try it on your own for the second case. Another simple one. This time, imagine you're walking down the street when you see a serious house fire. A crowd has begun to gather, but the fire department has not yet arrived. A woman is screaming that her toddler is inside. So far, no one is running into the burning house to rescue the child. You understand the gravity of the situation, but you are not a professional firefighter. According to Singer's principle, are you morally required to rescue the child? Or is it morally optional? Nice of you to do, but not required? Or like, should you not try to rescue the child for some reason? So take a stab at this one. Claim, define, connect. Feel free to roughly copy some of it, right? So if I'm just copying the first bit here, according to Singer's principle, you are/are not, which I don't know which one you're going to choose. Morally required to rescue the child. Or at least to try to act. We don't always know that we'll be successful for sure, but we ought to try if we have whatever relevant probability of being effective. To do nothing is or is not morally wrong. you have to make a claim. And when you do these claim, define, connect, maybe it's not yes or no, maybe it's yes assuming or no assuming for some cases. This one should be clear, but sometimes you may need to give a qualified answer, and that's acceptable too. The claim isn't always a simple yes or no. Okay. To do nothing is or is not morally wrong. Singer's principle states that this part's the same. In this case, now you do the connect step. I will leave you to finish that on your own. This completes the very detailed introduction to the first 5 to 6 paragraphs of Singer's famous Famine, Affluence, and Morality.